Hey guys, as usual, I wanted to bring a tier list of the most played hand traps and staple board breakers based on data from YCS, and you can watch my previous videos to understand how the tier scores are calculated. I'll also be relying on the cards seen in the topping list from the North American Remote Duel YCS for component C of the formula. And before I continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes below for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies. So starting with A tier, we of course have Bestial Magna take up the top spot, pretty much in most players' deck lists to fight off tier elements, but can be pretty good against a variety of rogue strategies as well, since most decks happen to have light or dark monsters that are integral to their strategies. This card in particular is very strong as it can search another Bestial for you in the end phase, and this recently got limited in the OCG, and I predict the same will happen to the TCG at some point. By a very narrow margin in the tier score, we also have Druid's Worm, which is always played alongside of Magma Nut. It's great because when it's sent to the graveyard, you can also send a special summon monster your opponent controls to the grave, which does come up, and not to mention it's just another DD Crow with a beefy body. Then we have Imperm make it back to tier A after falling drastically to tier C last month. I am noticing even tier lists now starting to play Imperm because it is very strong in the format despite the potential clash this card can have if you also have Havness. Great going first or second, although Sprite Elf's targeting protection can hamper its full effectiveness. Next, we are back to Bestials, and that is Serenir, which typically is not played in as many copies as Druid's Worm or Magma Nut, but definitely still being played at least in the side for most decks running Bestials. Its effect is definitely the least useful out of the three, but you cannot complain about more DD Crows in this format. Then we have a non-hand trap in Triple Tactics Talents, which has proven to be a guaranteed card in tier elements, and is so strong that can sway a game state so much by itself. Being able to take your opponent's monster can mean a potentially easier OTK, but also being able to draw 2 to continue comboing off, or if you already have everything you need, taking a look at your opponent's hand to spin a card is very strong. We then start off tier B with Dark Ruler No More, which was seeing more play as of the last remote YCS. While not played as much as when Sprite and tier elements first got introduced to the game, the card still has strong applicability and is the best way to shut down your opponent's board. While not being able to kill your opponent the same turn is a nuisance, being able to just break their board and build your own basically ends up being the same thing anyways. Then we have Feather Duster, which is a key staple to have considering the amount of floodgates rogue decks are running, such as Necro Valley or Rivalry of Warlords. Sadly, the card is not great against tier elements, but I don't think anyone would argue if you decide to have it in your side. Similarly, we have Lightning Storm, which is seeing more play in the side deck as well, as back removal and potential monster removal is pretty nice to have. While Raigeki did not end up making this list, that card is also seeing some side deck play in Sprite lists in particular as well, and Lightning Storm also provides a bit of a middle ground between Raigeki and Feather Duster. Next we have Dimension Shifter, which is a hand trap that only a select few decks can run optimally, but man is it strong. The best deck that can run this is of course Flunder, but you also have a variety of other decks such as Sprite, Exorcisters, Crystal Beasts, and many other strategies that are running this to combat against tiers, as the best they can do under that is to just set up Baguska, which to be fair is still pretty strong against a lot of decks. Definitely one of the more controversial cards out there as it's hard to stop and so impactful when it resolves. Twin Twisters is next and is currently the top quick play back removal choice over Cosmic Cyclone. Flunder is pretty popular right now, and having the best chance at sniping the Dreaming Town before the main phase is pretty important, and being able to discard Kelbeck or Agito or even Nimble Angler with Twin can be pretty nice and help start your combos as well. Then we have the return of Ash Blossom, which if you saw my recent NA Remote Duel YCS breakdown was seen in a few topping lists as well. Definitely has a place in this meta to stop the mill cards in tiers or even the tier monsters themselves, the most generic hand trap out there, and you are seeing Ash being played on a lot of Sprite lists for example. Then we have another hand trap in Effect Failure, which is nice to have since even after you Bestial, you can at least still use it, unlike Imperm where you have to make the decision whether you want to Imperm first before you Bestial anything. Helps that it's a tuner sometimes, and the fact that it's a light monster can potentially help if you're also playing any branded decks. Next we have Evenly Matched, which was still seeing a good amount of play in the topping list at the remote YCS, the strongest board wipe card there is, although it can conflict if you draw Bestials and end up summoning them out on your opponent's turn. Banishing cards face down is very strong, and I think Evenly has a place in this format as long as tiers are still around. Starting in tier C, we have Ghost Spell, which has become more of a popular hand trap thanks to the abundance of Ishizu Shufflers in so many decks, although mostly in tiers. Bell can also stop the tier fusion plays as well, and it can also help stop Elf Revival effect against Sprite or even tiers, so it definitely has a strong position in the current format. Next we have Super Polymerization, which for the most part has declined in play in the last month or two, although some tier lists are still lingering onto it since we have that situation where people don't play around Super Poly as well as they can because they know most people are not running it, which means if you do play Super Poly, then it can ironically be pretty effective. possibly a card that ends up getting limited again at some point, but I think right now it's fine. Then we have a card that is already limited in Claw by the Grave, which was in tier A in the last month I did this tier list. Still a pretty strong card, although in tier limit list I do not think they really played in the main and is mostly a side card to hopefully draw against Shifter. In the main I do find that in the mirror it becomes pretty bad as you're just negating that monster's effect until the end of the next turn, which basically means you're going to be affected too since you played the same cards, so keep that in mind. Next we have Cosmic Cyclone, which while not as popular as Twin Twisters right now is still quite strong considering that it banishes, so it will not trigger the tier element trap effects, and there's also a large growth in the runic decks online, and Cyclone can banish and play around that destruction protection of Hugin, although they do technically play the targeting protection card as well. Then we have Nibiru, which I have anecdotally experienced a growth in the play of this card despite being mostly dead since the start of the tier 0 format. You always have this with Nibiru where people stop playing it because it's bad, so then people stop playing around Nibiru, and so then it technically becomes good and really catch players off guard. Definitely good against rogue decks usually as well, as it always has been. Next we have the one and only Kashtira Fenrir, which technically is probably seeing a bit of a boost in the numbers because people are also playing the actual Kashtira deck and not just Fenrir as a staple. Regardless, this card is very strong and good against Tears and Flunder and can be good going first and second, with its only downside being that it can conflict with Bestials if you play both, as you need to control no monsters to special summon this card. Very expensive right now and probably will not be going down considering the release of Photon Hypernova in the next couple months. Then we have Gamma, which sees play only in the side deck if played at all nowadays, which is primarily used to stop Shifter since there's not many other ways to stop it. Having to play Driver is unfortunate, and you do also have to consider your siding pattern since you have to incorporate that 4-card package, but can certainly be devastating to the opponent if you manage to resolve it, especially on your own turn. Next we have Forbidden Droplets, which while not as played often as Dark Ruler, whether online or at the YCS, is still a strong card and can at least provide a bit more versatility where it can be played going first as well. The main downside of this card in the current format, where so many decks are running Shifter, is that this card just becomes dead in that scenario, so definitely something to consider when choosing between this and Dark Ruler, or maybe you just run both. Then we have Solemn Judgment, which was not played too much among the topping lists at the YCS, but I do find that it always seems to be a popular card online. On Dueling Book, obviously a very strong card, and one thing to consider is that while paying half the life points is not as big deal, particularly in online play where there's no time restrictions, it can certainly be a consideration to not play it in a tournament play, especially in current format, as tier plays can take so long on both turns, hence the abundance of time cards being played in most players' side decks right now. Then lastly in tier D, we do have Droll Lockbird, which honestly is pretty sneaky good hand trap right now against a lot of decks. Obviously really good against Flunder if they did not Shifter you, and can at least have some impact against other decks as well. And most importantly, most players are not expecting this card, so they are not playing around Droll as best as they possibly can, and can certainly end up getting punished. Next we have Lava Golem, which still managed to get into the tier list and is honestly a solid option for clearing boards like Tier Limits or Sprite, as long as you're a deck that does not really need the normal summon, which admittedly is a bit hard for most decks. Being able to burn as well is an extra plus, although it is a big body at 3000 attack, so you better have an easy way to get rid of it. Lastly, we have DD Crow, which sorta has gotten that Woody treatment and is no longer the fancy new toy as the Bestials came in to take its place. But for decks that cannot really run Bestials or prefer not to run Bestials because it conflicts with their strategy, it's still a great card to have to stop either the tier fusions or even trying to hit the shufflers to force their effects out before you start doing your plays. Alright guys, so that was it for this month's Hand Trap and Staple tier list. Hope that was interesting. The next YCS level event is not until next month with the Latin American Remote YCS, so stay tuned for that next one for the next breakdown. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Bear Lord, Spooky Boogie, Steven Phillips, and Chaz Blanks, as always for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, link down below. Take care guys.